Okay, we are on with President Melik of the Unity Environmental University. I won't do the introduction because I'll let him introduce himself because I think it's great. But I'd love to get in there. There's a lot of very hot topics that we'd love to get into with you, President Malik. But let's just start with the audience in terms of who you are and what institution you're leading and why it matters.
Sure. Melik Khoury. I'm the president and CEO of Unity Environmental University. We are America's environmental university, and when we are the first institution to really look at the environmental sciences and sustainability and say, how can we make it accessible to everyone? We're not there yet, but we're trying. And really create a tech stack, a governance model, and an approach that says STEM can be done differently than the traditional approach. Our claim to fame is we are the first institution in the United States to divest our endowment portfolio from fossil fuels. We are one of the first institutions in Maine to launch 90 credit baccalaureate degrees. And we are very proud of the fact that we are number one in private schools for social mobility across the nation. And my favorite, we have kept tuition flat since 2018 and hope to continue to do so till 2030 at the minimum.
That's definitely music to our ears because President Malik, I'm not sure if you know, but the mission that Jeff and I have started a couple years ago is to reduce student debt. I mean, at $1.8 trillion, that's just simply not sustainable. So absolutely music to our ear. But I want to dive into a little bit of this because I think I've been following you on LinkedIn. We met at a couple of conferences and, I would say that and tell me if you don't think this is a fair characterization. Okay. You're not the typical, at least in my perception, you're not the typical higher ed president in the sense that you're very innovative. You are not afraid to challenge the status quo. You're not afraid to speak out against the what is considered to be the norms or the standards in higher ed. And as a result, I mean, it speaks for itself. You mentioned being in the top 1%. Unity has grown 10x in the last 10 years, while a lot of institutions are either closing the doors or shutting down. So give us a sense of what's prompted you to be a non-traditional, if you will. I'm trying to find a better way to describe
Yeah,
you, but
I think, I've spent most of my career in higher education, and I have been at an R1 school, at a primarily online school, at a small private regional school, a small state regional school. And, my motivation is I actually drank the Kool-Aid that education can change someone's life. And I also know, having been born and raised in West Africa, the value of ignorance when people make sure you don't know what you don't know so that you can stay subjugated. And so when I came to the United States, I was one of the lucky few. I got that scholarship. I got that experience. I bought in. Then from within, I started to realize that even though LBJ in 1965 tried to create this utopia that everybody deserves an education because we will have better citizens, we actually never as a country evolved the model to actually be scalable and accessible. And we are coveting a model that only works for the 5%. So in some ways, I'm not somebody from industry that came into higher ed like a bull in a china shop. I witnessed firsthand the value of an education, and I understood very quickly that we don't have bad people in higher ed. We just have people who don't understand that the construct that we put in place was never designed for mass production.
so I know you said we don't have bad people in higher ed, and I agree, because I don't think anybody would wake up in the morning and say, today I'm just going to show up to work and be a complete jerk or to slow down the progress, right? But we've seen that firsthand, and we've seen a well-documented gap between higher ed and industry, between grad and job-ready talent. And we've seen that often. If you can go into a little bit more specificity in terms from your view, because, one of the things you talk about, which is, for example, you don't have committees. You don't have meetings to talk about meetings. And you've done away with a lot of that, what you view as bureaucratic process. So if you can kind of give us a sense of, in your view, what are some of the big issues facing higher ed today? I'd love to hear from your point and in a way to kind of contrast where Unity is going.
Sure. I mean, we had all of those things and more. And everywhere I've worked had all of those things and more. I think, to your earlier point, a lot of people out there say the higher education model is broken. I argue, and you'll hear me talk and write, that it's not. It's working exactly like it's supposed to be. A model that was created in the 18th century that was always designed for a small group to get all the knowledge in an era where knowledge was not abundant. We have never actually looked at the industry and said, with the democratization of knowledge, with the advent of technology, and with the idea that everybody deserves an education, how do you run an organization that does not compromise on rigor or content, but changes the approach for the working adult, the person who can't afford the big check, and the person who might not want a full residential program? So I think, Charlie, there's a couple of things going there. It's a very complex question. We've also never even determined as a nation if education is an industry or a public good. Because if it's a public good, I have a completely different answer for you. If it is an industry, I have a completely different answer for you. But to answer your question more directly, when I became president, nothing that our board of trustees wanted and that our faculty and staff wanted was not what I wanted. But we were told there was only one way to do it. And that way only worked in an era of abundance. And so my approach at Unity is not necessarily the same approach I would use if I worked at another institution. But we realized very, very quickly that we were a tuition-driven institution that had a regional draw that needed a national draw. And you can have a regional draw product and have it have national attention. And we couldn't create it for only those who could afford the 4-year tuition model. And we needed to stop emulating the trust fund colleges that could afford the multitude of committees, because their hardest decision was who gets the money, not how do we create value. We also had to make a very, very tough decision. Were we building for the capacity of our space, or were we building for scale? Because everybody deserves access to environmental science and sustainability education if they want it, even if they couldn't come to campus. So when we knew our sideboards, and then we deconstructed tradition into the lowest common denominator of regulation versus tradition, then we were able to put things back together in a way that says, if you want the 4-year model, great. We had to prioritize agility over conservation. And so that model didn't work. And I think, Charlie, that's the problem. Most institutions are still working as if they are protecting something instead of how do we reach more people.
Melik, that's always been part of the innovator's dilemma, right? Is protection of the current status quo versus venturing out into the unknown. When I was reading about Unity, I came across the term social enterprise business units, which in my conversations doesn't get thrown around very much, but when it does, it's a governance innovation, right? But you've occupied so many roles, especially at Unity. You're one of the, in fact, I don't know any other university president who's operated, been the chief administrative officer. Can you tell us a little bit about your social enterprise business units and kind of how it became a workforce delivery system, right? I mean, you've cut things. Why did you cut them? How did accreditors react? How did employer partners react? I'm really interested in that. I think it's part of the story you're telling.
Yeah, I mean, I think so, because I've worked in some small regional colleges, there are 2 mistakes that a lot of presidents make. One is no one's ever going to vote against their own interest. And I think sometimes we confuse collaboration and voice with consensus, and I had to learn the difference. And so, but what I learned is you have a dedicated group of faculty and staff and an operating cadence catalog handbook that works for a 4-year residential model. Coming to that group and saying, do all of that and now do something else. In their mind, even if they had the bandwidth, to a hammer, everything is a nail. They're going to take that perspective and try to put it into workforce. They're going to take that perspective and they're going to try to put it into online and into expedition. And what you get is just a different colored residential program. So the enterprise model was a design construct that said the things that do not touch the learner, back end, can be centralized to reduce overhead for the different, we call them strategic educational business units, verticals, subsidiaries, whatever you want to call them. The things that lean to the learner need to be differentiated, and each vertical cannot be restrained and constrained by the policies and governance of the other one. So when we started this model, we said, fine, let's keep the residential 4-year model semester and all of its governance, pull out all the centralized, and then build new verticals that allowed them to create new handbooks, new pedagogies. And that way, if it failed, you can stop it and you're not hurting your core business. And if it survives, which is why I hate the concept of pilots. You don't put it in the very atmosphere that it couldn't thrive in. And then we had to make the most important of all changes, which is it's no longer alternative revenue, as if there's one real education and everything else is secondary. There is no one ring to rule them all. Every subsidiary needed its own identity, its own brand, its own ability to thrive and fail, and then they can cross-sell if they want to. And we decided to divide that by audience, which gave us unprecedented flexibility to change tuition and calendar and pedagogy and all of that, while at the same time keeping accreditation, rigor, compliance, assessment, and centralized services like financial aid registrar. So we became our own edtech firm selling to our own campuses that did not need to duplicate resources. Now, it sounds easy, but in a culture where people are used to a zero-sum game, it became a cultural battle that almost shut us down. And so that's the model itself. And so now my subsidiaries, they trade resources. So if my online is an in-person, they buy it from them. If my in-person was an online, so keeping the verticals pure, but the students are free to roam, knowing no different than if you're in a residential campus taking an online course from us. Same idea. Now it means I can now acquire institutions. I can partner with institutions. I can build more verticals with a completely different pedagogical tuition approach and never have to threaten what is already working. And when one of those verticals loses its market share, I can redistribute the employees without having to do layoffs. So it's just a unique model. It's almost a system office, that really looks at each vertical as an independent actor that is controlled by the parent company so that there is no duplication of the things we do not want duplicated.
You know, you said something.
Go ahead, Charlie. I was going to ask,
Yeah,
what was the path to get there? Like, I mean, like you said, it sounds like, gosh, this is the way to do things,
Yeah.
but I'm sure that change is difficult, right? Can you just tell us a quick story about what the path to get to this model?
That was the biggest revelation of all.
Yeah.
Because the presidents before me at Unity were significantly more accomplished and they did some really wonderful work in their own right. 2 presidents ago brought in the social sciences in a way that this institution had never seen. My predecessor had brought in the hard sciences in a way this institution had never seen. But what the board was struggling with is yet our enrollment was going down, we were getting more expensive, and we couldn't scale. What most institutions don't realize is that between your bylaws, your policies, and your governance, and even sometimes your charter, the best communicator in the world does not actually have the path to yes. And we blame...
That's a mouthful, by the way. That's a mouthful of all the charter and everything else. Sorry
Yes.
to interrupt.
So the system is designed for every constituency to say no. And the only path to transition for many presidents or provosts or whoever you may call it, or dean, is getting the people to sometimes vote on something they cannot see and they're not incentivized to change. And then you blame and then we use the usual jargon, transparency, accountability. Once we start crying foul and writing letters to the media, everybody starts to go into protection mode and then everything stops. So for me, I realized that the rules were written as if we were a Harvard to protect $1 billion endowment that we did not have. And so I had to change the rules of engagement. Then I had to train my board and my team to understand that the 30% who don't like this are going to sound like the 70% and create a pathway for success to absorb all of that crazy that came out in the newspapers and the accusations and the votes of this and all of that until we normalize. And that, I think, is what most institutions don't do, is they're trying to change in a model that was designed not to change. And any board that thinks that they're going to hire the president who is somehow going to talk people into this, no.
You know, you talk about higher ed is not broken.
Mhm.
And this is actually the second time I've heard it, and it resonated greatly with me. When you said higher ed is not broken, it is doing exactly what it's designed to do. But
Mhm.
that design came out decades and decades ago, right? If you have to kind of benchmark, what in your mind, what is a successful higher ed institution today in the face of AI? What it looks like what it can accomplish, and then help us kind of assess, if you will, the gap between where higher ed currently is and where it should be today.
Honestly, I think the model is unity. I'm not, because I got this model from learning from the best. I took elements of ASU. I took elements of WGU and SNU. I took models from Cornell and Harvard and realized very, very quickly that the model will differ based on your mission as an institution. If your mission is capacity to for the best of the best and you want the cream of the crop, you have one approach. If your model is to scale to reach the most number of learners as possible, there's another approach. And so that is the fight that I'm fighting. Is there is no supermodel. There is that, but you have to understand the regulation. You have to understand the customer and the mission, and you have to have the flexibility to create organizational change that comes from a position of accountability, not emotion. And so, for example, the reason why I think the unity model will someday be the model is because it allows for you to create. Let me pick on Yamaha. You've heard me talk about this before. The people who build motorcycles at Yamaha and the people who build pianos at Yamaha are not the same people. It's still Yamaha, and Yamaha is a corp. Think about Johnson & Johnson. Think about Procter & Gamble. Think about GE. If we are talking about scalable education, you need a core for assessment, controls, R&D, deployment, and then you need to be able to launch vertical models, whether it's location-based, expeditionary-based, synchronous, asynchronous, to provide the kind of learning. That is why I also don't believe in non-credit. I think any learning can be assessed, and at Unity, we can assess most learnings to as small as 0.2 credit. But partner with the community, partner with the business, partner with the region, use their ecosystem, use their resources, don't duplicate anything you don't have to duplicate, and bring the learning. So the model is about understanding where you want to go and have a modular approach while having a very, very strong tech stack, IP, and operational governance model to be as nimble as possible. And I think that's the future.
I want to double click into this a little bit. You mentioned if you were building a school for public good, you would go with one direction. If you were building it as an industry, you would go in another direction. Give us a sense in terms of kind of where we're at today. What does that, either way, what does it have to do with driving job outcomes? Because that's, essentially that is one of the key tenets, key mission component, in my opinion, for any higher ed institution, whether you're industry or public good. At the end of the day, most people go to school for what that piece of paper can do for their career, for their family long term, right? So I want to dig into that a little bit more, because the concern is there's a lot of talk about, you brought up ASU, probably more traditional, but SNU and WGU and others are more non-traditional. And it's arguable that a lot of the students for those schools are already in a job. And so the job outcome aspect may not be as critical to the Harvard, Yale of the world. Those brands, they sell themselves. The network is so strong when you come out one of those schools. But for everybody else, at Unity, as much success as you have at Unity, it's still relatively not yet a household name, right?
Correct.
So if you can kind of double click into that and help us understand the job outcome component, whether you are public good or you're in industry, what does that look like, and how are you driving toward that at Unity?
Sure. I'll start by using a military example. Imagine if we said we need the best military in the world, but we only had West Point. You would be graduating the top 1% and they would have no one to lead. And I think we've made a mistake in this nation, and we have blurred the different colleges and their purpose, because everything it goes towards one accredited vision, which tends to be historically faculty centric and built at a time when higher education wasn't the vehicle for workforce placement. Unfortunately, Charlie, we are still arguing whether we are supposed to be graduating leaders. But if everybody is the CEO, who is the COO? If everybody's the COO, who's the director of finance? I know it's a silly example, right? But you can't have Eisenhower without somebody driving the Jeep, without somebody strategizing. And I think the accreditors and the peer approach over the years, when we mass scale this and with good intent provided the financial aid, we never differentiated. And US News Report is the worst offender of all of this. Because if you, the more students you deny, the bigger your endowment, the better school you are. I don't get it. And so it's just now that people are beginning to realize that you go to an Ivy League school for a different reason than you go to a community college. And so I think, Shadi, we have to really discern as an industry, what is the role of each type of institution? Are we bringing in the enlisted officers to use, or are we bringing in the commissioned officers? Or are we bringing rank and file? So for me, to answer your question, a lot of the governance has never transitioned from the day when most of the faculty were told that their job is to teach. They were supposed to perpetuate the knowledge. Get your baccalaureate, get your master's, get your PhD, so you can be the keeper of knowledge to bestow it to the next generation. They never saw it as an industry. And the knowledge creators, which is the R1 schools, the Stanford, their knowledge needs to be then taken to the second tier institution to use that to apply it. But when the second tiered institution, and I don't mean tier by better or worse, like the generators of knowledge versus the teachers, when they both have the same KPI, you have a blur. And so I think what's happened is everybody covets that elite. We've built everything around it, and we're still arguing the reason for learning. And AI, the abundance, there's a paper I just wrote about the library card. That basically says, like right now, I'm being told because of AI, we don't need education anymore because you can get everything from a prompt. And I push back very hard. Here's why. You know who said that about 25 years ago? Robin Williams in Good Will Hunting, where he said, and I quote, if you've got a library card and $20 in late fees, you have access to the entire world's knowledge. Yes. However, if you don't know how to curate it, how to understand it, how to apply it, how to understand what is fact, what is fiction, then you are overwhelmed by knowledge, which is why education, you'll have the R1s who create knowledge. Then you'll have the rest of us who need to take that knowledge, make sure our faculty are up to speed, and use design principles to curate that knowledge in a way that makes the next graduate culturally competent, civic-minded, environmentally aware, and career-ready. Because otherwise, this false dichotomies, you're either learning to turn a widget or you're a smart human being, is what is hurting us. But most faculty are doing what they think is right, which is the governance model that says education for education's sake is the gatekeeper of knowledge.
You know what, Malik? Sorry, Jeff, I got to follow up
Yeah.
with that. I mean, there's so much good stuff in there, Malik, that I just have to unpack. And one of the first thing I would say though is what I think I hear what you're saying is every institution have to have a definition of what that job outcome is for their grads. I mean, so if you're in a college of education or you're college of engineering, you have to have that view because to your point, not everybody's a CEO or COO. I would venture to say that my view is a little bit different because I think you give them too much credit. I don't think a lot of the schools actually have an idea of what job outcome as a concept is. And here's why. I took statistic in a traditional school when I was 19, 20. Nothing stuck with me. I mean, I was like, everything was just, and then when it was actually taught by the chief marketing officer overseeing Coca-Cola at the University of Phoenix and how he tied everything that in the book to what's happening in real life, then it's like, boom, 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 the light bulb went off the moment, right? Yeah. So I guess I want to dive in a little bit because I don't think most institutions outside of Harvard, Yale, and have a clear idea of the concept of job outcome. And a lot of them,
Charlie, some of them even resist it. I've had people say to me, you don't go to school to get a job. But the problem is they are working from a set of rules that have never been updated. So yes, I am being kind because at the same time, people who do wrong, not knowing it's wrong, is different than people who do wrong willfully. And because we've insulated the academic community from the forces, they've always just been able to just walk out of the room and there's nothing you can do, right? Not show up to a meeting and you don't have quorum. They have all the power with the alums, and then letters to the editor goes out, and reporters don't seem to tie the stories as if every story is unique. They've always had the ability to stop change. And the accreditors to their defense, use those very faculty to evaluate each other. So you're not wrong, but I'm saying is we have not changed the rules, because that would have to be a shift in power, because then they start to talk about academic rigor, then they start to talk about academic freedom. And if you as an administrator, if you as a regulator don't know what that is, you flinch. At Unity, when we started down this journey, my CEO and I had to do the most interesting thing of all. It wasn't enough to define what those things were. We had to define what they weren't. And so, for me, I would also take your idea a step further and say, I have always believed that government, industry, and education should be independent but relevant. That Venn diagram is beginning to become 3 circles. And so we are losing relevance. Think about this. How many accreditors have industry professionals on their commission? 0. There is no industry voice. And when you try to work with industry, we call it non-credit. You know what non-credit means? I am too scared to pass it through governance. So at the end of the day, we have created all of these kabuki theater workarounds because we don't want to address one thing. Students go to college because we don't want them just to become factory workers that turn widgets. But at the same time, we don't want them graduating. And if everybody is a professor, then who is a student? And so I think it's a complex answer to say there needs new regulation. We need to define rigor and outcomes, not by US News and World Report for the rest of us, but by another measure. And the reason why sometimes I push employment as a measure is because some people choose not to work. Some people become entrepreneurs. Some people come from money and after the education. I don't want to punish an institution because they've got graduates who are doing things that are not defined into the workforce. But at the same time, I am tired of entertaining the conversation that being well-educated and being career-ready is somehow at odds.
Melik, I don't want to divert course here, but we started out talking about it, and my perception of you is as someone who is kind of deeply invested in the stakeholder model, right? And thinking about things holistically. So if we dive into students and the student experience, you've built an AI tutor, right? And it's directly in your learning management system, and your students are using it every day. So I want to know what you're teaching them about working alongside AI that we should be teaching the rest of the workforce. And what are you surprised by watching your students use it?
Cognitive dissonance. Really, there's a disconnect between the national language, you're supposed to hate it or you're supposed to love it, versus the reality of how messy it is. It's a new field, and we are learning what we are learning. When I used to make a joke at my meetings that there was a time that leeching and cigarettes were considered medical benefits. We know better. We don't use them anymore. But I do not want my graduates to graduate and an identity, a moral view of AI. I wanted to have a practical and operational model of AI. So at Unity, we're never going to be the AI school, where people are going to learn AI majors. But if they graduate from Unity and they don't know what AI is, how to use it, how you can be lazy with it, how you can be better with it, its energy consumption, its practicality, the good and the bad. There's an old proverb from the Far East that I love. I would rather be a warrior in a garden than a farmer at war. And right now, AI is evolving, and I want my graduates to understand it. So when the science is there, if it will solve climate change, I want to be in the forefront of it. And if it's really, really bad, I want them to understand and change from within and not just shaking science from outside that nobody pays attention to. I want them in boardrooms. I want them in factories. I want them in farms. And they understand that AI we have to rewire our brain so we can be more productive. Or is AI truly something that we have to be afraid of? No one knows that. That's why these CEOs that are saying, I'm going to divert a little bit from higher ed. Any CEO out there that says, I am cutting my employee base to invest in AI is saying to their shareholders, I don't know what to do, but if I say that, my stock price is less likely to drop.
Amen, Melik. Amen on that.
Because in my organization, my employees are saying, I'm going to use AI because I want to prove to Melik that my position is valued twice as much as it was 2 years ago, which is why I have made my employees a promise. We have a viability matrix for every employee at Unity. Think about a 50-hour week. This is the kind of productivity you do. Prove to me that you've doubled your productivity without adding hours, and I will pay you more. And so right now we have a $100,000 challenge. Unity Environmental University will be the first university by 2030 that every employee, from the entry level all the way to a supervisor will not make less than $100,000 while I keep tuition flat and I keep my graduates relevant to the workforce. That's the measure in which we come to work every day and say, how do we teach? How do we learn? How do we empower? And not put process for process sake. So AI is, if I tell you I'm in love with AI, I'm lying to you. But I don't want AI to become the next climate change, which is a political and identity politics conversation and not a scientific one.
Malik, by putting that incentive out there to your people, I mean, what do you hope to accomplish as an outcome of that 2x in productivity gain?
I can prove two things. You don't have to be a rich elite school to pay your people well. And you can create scale and affordability because the more productive you are without burning out, the more people you can teach. My goal is to reduce our tuition even further when I realize economies of scale.
So
More
enrollment
people learn.
growth. Enrollment growth is an important one of many metrics, I'm sure, but it's an important metric that you want to see as outcome of this.
Yes, without losing the quality. I use the supply chain. We can't get so far from the student in our innovation that the more we grow, the worse experience they have.
You know, I've seen your post on this. It's a huge smile on my face as you know, candidly, my background and Jeff as well. I started University of Phoenix 20, 30 years ago when everybody was challenging the concept of online learning. Imagine that, right?
Yeah.
I mean, online learning, that's not real. But anyway, so this is not about University of Phoenix, but the whole idea of, you know, treating your student as a customer and not just as a juvenile who doesn't know better. Right. I think your view, and I don't want to put words in your mouth, but I think your view is you got to treat your students as customers. You got to accommodate them. You got to hear them out. You got to delight them, and you got to provide outcomes for them. Right. Talk to us a little bit about your philosophy in that, because I think in higher ed, that is still such a no word. Oh, no, you don't refer to students as customers. You just don't.
Yeah, I'm going to feel like, so my answer is complex as per usual. So two things.
No way.
The reason why people assume that the moment you say customer, it means great inflation, it means reduced rigor. My students have the right to fail. No faculty member at Unity, no dean ever worries about failing a student. Because the moment that starts to be the conversation, we've lost the thread. We have an obligation to graduate somebody and our degree means something. But that being said, we can change the pedagogical and andragogical approach. We can bite-size the learning. We can provide academic support. We can provide advising. We can create the atmosphere that maximizes that student's ability to succeed within the framework of our tuition model, but they have to meet us halfway, which is why, Charlie, for example, at Unity, our online program is basically all about open access. Yet we have a 77% retention rate. The reason for that is they have to literally sign 5 documents with an advisor about the expectations of what it means to be at Unity. And if they don't live up to that, that is on them. And so this idea that the moment you talk about them, when you hear that pushback against customer, what you're hearing is, does that mean I have to pass them? Does that mean I have to baby them? No. If anything, the people who are saying that are babying their students the most. And those graduates are graduating without any resilience. So I would argue it's about truth in advertising. This is the level we can support. For example, I'll give you very specific. If you can't dedicate 20 hours a week to Unity, don't be in that degree program. You will not succeed. If you can't afford X number of payments per month, don't come to Unity. If you can't read, write, blah, blah, blah at this level, don't come to Unity, because then you will need extra help. And if that student chooses the extra help, that's fine. But we will offer what we can offer. I actually learned this from the Marines. You get to ring the bell. So we've taken an opt-in instead of, we are going to decide that you cannot make it to protect my U.S. News and World Report. If I see one more press release celebrated that somebody dropped the acceptance rate from 3.9 to 2.8, while at the same time saying, we care about access to education, where is the media's ability to say, well, that's not really about access, that is about privilege. Now, don't get me wrong. I got nothing against the rich. And if you can get into that school, more power to you. But somebody has to show up every day and make sure the engines are running. And we cannot make students feel less than because they did not get that scholarship.
Melik, you know, you've gone from a school with a very small enrollment, like in the hundreds, right? Which was residential, to a strong online series of programs with working adult learners. And I think this is part of that story about the elite schools. They really don't focus on working adult learners. But at the same time, you've made the case that employers really need to focus on working adult learners. Can you make the case for us why those non-traditional students, which are kind of the new learner majority, are the ones that employers should focus on?
Sure. Well, it starts, the president of National University affectionately calls them the ghost students because nobody counts them. There's a president I knew about 30 years ago who I won't name. I respect him a lot, who used to say, if you want to get on the rankings, bring in 10,000 non-traditional students, bring only 50 freshmen, give them $250,000 each, get your retention at 100%, and everybody will think you're awesome. Or other schools that I know till today who just don't count anybody who doesn't start at their, the games are abundant. But to your point, the adult student is a failure of our model in higher education to evolve because most of those people are some credit, no degree. And the reason that they are some credit, no degree is because we said to them, if you can't move, if you can't take 15 credits, if you can't work your job around me, if you can't work your family around my schedule, because I don't teach on Fridays, I don't teach in the evenings, and I only offer this course every third semester, then somehow you are less than. So one of the things I'm very careful about, Jeff, is I don't like to say one is better than the other. There is a space in higher education for the coming of age American Rumspringa experience, where if you can afford it or you get the scholarship to go into that beautiful residential campus, great. But that experience has to be industry partnered too. You can't spend 4 years in that campus and then you can't survive your first job interview. For the adult, same idea. They tried it. Places like Phoenix, I laugh when people talk about online schools, but there's a reason why, Phoenix grew as much as it did. It's because the world said, yes, we need an education. And most of us said, you're not good enough. And that is the sin that we will pay for a generation, right? So I'm trying to demystify one is better than the other. But to your point, the adult student has a built-in resilience that is different than the student whose curated resilience is built through athletics and clubs and organizations and internships. Two different paths. The military vet is a good example. One of the growing populations at Unity are vets and family of vets because they can't move. They need a job, but they want a degree. They want to apply it to something meaningful. But the reality is there is a unique opportunity with AI and technology and the economic drive to say, how do corporations change the intake of unskilled and semi-skilled labor? How do universities partner with them? How does government help that? And then how do we take the knowledge generated by the R1s and the elite to constantly stay at the cutting edge of workforce readiness and decent citizenry? That is the future. The problem, Jeff, is everybody's looking at the Ivies to solve it. And as much as I love them, they have no motivation to solve it.
I'm often pretty tough on higher ed in general. That's because I want higher ed to succeed.
Yes.
I want higher ed in US to continue to thrive. And because I sincerely believe that is the engine for economic, prosperity. What I've heard today is, your tuition has been frozen since 2018, cost low. You treat students not just as a student, but as a customer with rigor, with standards. So it's not an either or, it's both. You centralize and achieve great efficiency with your operating model. And you're not afraid to challenge the status quo. You're not afraid to ask the right question. And you're not afraid to push back at the board or the team. So these are really good insights. But we've seen a lot of schools have closed. The closure rate has accelerated actually in higher ed as the last few years. If you have to sit in front of a bunch of presidents today and say, look, here's what I've done in the last 10 years, growing from a few hundred students to now over 10,000. Right? What else would you tell them? What else would you empower them to go against the grain, if you will?
Well, that is not hypothetical for me. Over the last 3 years, I've sat with about 25 presidents. Some of those colleges now closed and some will close soon, and some are doing fine. And at the end of the day, I'll go back to my original statement, Charlie. Everybody knows what to do. but we do not have the motivational levers because I will tell you the personal malignment that till today I am considered blackballed in many mucky muck organizations because I dared to challenge because of the idea of where there's smoke, there's fire. And we as an industry we will threaten you if you make change. And if you don't back down, it doesn't have to be true. It just has to be printed as an opinion piece because the young reporter is my landlord or my tenant or my mentee. You're asking leaders who were never trained to be resilient, who become presidents because they love the work, to put their personal reputation on the line, to make a change for a college that would soon see them rot for standing against the high sparrows. That's the problem. And so a lot of them will tell me, well, wait till I retire, then talk to my successor. Or, I need to get that job with that consulting. I mean, here's another problem that's happened, Charlie. And if we're talking frankly, I'm going to lay it on the line. The consulting world has overcalled anyone because we all went to the consulting and now we're just telling colleges what to do and we're not changing it within it and they can't do it. So I'm not sure the presidents are the ones. You got to look at the people who are hiring the presidents, and you've got to look at the media, and you've got to look at the boards, and you've got to look at the regulators who have not created a system where a change agent does not have to risk their family's livelihood to simply say, we're adding a major. I mean, it's insane.
Melik,
Jeff,
yeah.
hang on, just
Yeah,
one
yeah.
more thing, because
Go ahead.
it's just so fascinating because I think to your point, all the presidents, they know what to do, but you report to the board, right?
Yeah.
So ultimately, if you don't have the board behind you, and you have to do quite a bit for them to see, to believe in your visions and to support you. And I think that's the major bottleneck for a lot of them. If you can share a little bit of your own experience.
I go back to what I said earlier. The rules aren't designed for success, for change. Because, I mean, here's my work at Unity, Charlie. A lot of people talk about our enrollment goal, our student success. But the preponderance of my work at Unity has been governance change. Because putting a mirror in front of these boards, you have to remember, they are volunteers. When there is an outcry, they look at that outcry from the lens of their industry, which has a higher threshold than higher ed. And so we have given these boards that were designed originally to protect an endowment, or they were owners who hired a CEO to spend their resources, to be making decisions when they don't know enough and they want to save the reputation of the institution. I mean, that's why you're seeing a lot of this stuff in the media now when presidents are finally fighting back and not just accepting resignation, because some faculty member plays racquetball with a trustee's wife, and all of a sudden, you as a president or a provost or a chief enrollment officer have to defend your honor because that is how you stop change in higher ed. Governance, that's why governance and regulation has not caught up with the tuition driven. And all of this is because we have stopped funding higher ed, but we still run it like it's funded.
Melik, for our audience, I just want to point out how beautiful your last two answers are as far as mentorship on approaching problems and how they contribute to your success. I'm a big fan of the stakeholder model. And what I've perceived from you is you just talked about your board, you talked about your students and their families, you talked about your faculty, you've talked about the media, you've talked about regulators. And, we were joking around a little bit earlier about your answers being complex, but I would posit that instead of something to shy away from, complexity is beautiful and rich. And I think with your innovation, with the sustainable education business units and the way you look at things, for all of our audience, this is a masterclass in how to approach problems. And I'd like to say, I'm grateful for you being on the show, Melik.
Jeff, to your point, the formula is simple. Complex at the back end, simplify in the front end, right? So my students can go from in-person to online. At the back end, it's all cross-selling and measure, right? They don't care. And
That's
can
right.
we stop telling the students how crappy we are and then wondering why they don't want to go to college? Can we stop whining to the media because we have to teach on a Friday and then really concerned why there's public confidence that is declining? Go to one bakery. If all you hear from the cooks is how awful it is to work there, because now you have to cook 3 types of bread instead of just the original sourdough, I'm just going to go to the bakery down the street. As a nation, it's simple. Treat your military, treat your education, and treat your healthcare without any partisan politics. And you will have the strongest, most resilient. And then if you keep your industry, your government, and your education independent, but interconnected and relevant, we will make it another 250 years. But it starts with understanding that Harvard and their ilk have a place. Community colleges, great places. They should never want to be a 4-year school. Have a place. The rest of us tuition-driven have a place. And until we understand that, we're going to be arguing about voice and this and that and all the things. Like, for example, the media was absolutely and utterly a buzz because Harvard is going to give 5 less A's. Who cares? More power to you, Harvard. More power to you. But you know what? The rest of us, we need to put 180,000 people into the workforce.
Melik Khoury, ladies and gentlemen.
For the record, there's nothing wrong with sourdough, just for the record.
Sourdough's the best.
Fan of it, but sourdough's great.
Sourdough's the best.
Thank you, President Melik. And cheers to another 250 years for us. Thank you so much for coming on to the Job Ready podcast.
We appreciate you.
Thank you both.